Today I'm back to talk about some backlist science fiction fantasy I've been reading recently, and I have a couple of highlights in this video, one being the fact that I found a science fiction book that I should have hated, but I kind of loved, but you're all probably gonna hate it, so I feel reluctant to recommend it to you all. As well, I found a fantasy series that helped to scratch the itch, or specifically fill the void, as I slowly come to the realization that I should have come to a long time ago, and that is the fact that A Song of Ice and Fire is never getting finished, but if you're looking for something with a similar feel, I have you covered with a good recommendation, something that I think a lot of you will enjoy if you haven't already read it. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's start with science fiction, as I like to do, particularly with that book that I had such a mixed reaction to, and that is Gnomon by Nick Harkaway. I have never read this author before, but based off my experience here, I definitely want to try out more. This is a long literary science fiction book that is set in a future that essentially is seen as a dystopian Big Brother society where everything is so transparent. So everything done is captured on video, everything that is said is recorded, and even the government can access people's thoughts. And this is all meant to be done in a way, again, to have full transparency of our world. The general catalyst that starts off the story is the fact that someone who is in custody dies, and so there's the question of what happened, and particularly it's the question of what happened, or why don't we know what happened, because again, if everything is recorded and made public, why is there a mystery at all? And so that's the basic setup to this one, but I do want to preface that there's a lot more to this story. It's very ambitious, and this is both what I love about the story and also perhaps it's failing, or it's at least a challenge about it, is the fact that it is an unwieldy story that is so ambitious, trying to do so many things, which, if you follow my channel, usually a messy narrative is a no-go for me. I'm usually highly critical of them. However, in this case, despite it being long and winding and kind of felt like it was a monster of a narrative that grew and grew in so many directions, I had such a good time reading it. So this is one where I started the book and I loved the writing so much that I actually paused it because I had some distracting noise in the background and I wanted to have pure silence when I was reading it. And I ended up reading the beginning and actually rereading several paragraphs, several chapters, not because I wasn't understanding it, but because it was so good, I just wanted to savor it. And as someone who tends to inhale books, it's something I get criticized for, I do respect that. I admit that it takes a really special book for me to properly slow down. And when a book is this good, it just naturally comes that I really savor it in a way that other books in my mind don't really justify taking my time to savor and think about every word on the page, because it feels like they're more perhaps for plot rather than the narrative structure and prose. Here, it was just such an innovative read. I felt like there was some really interesting things the author was doing in the writing and dialogue, the way the story was told. Again, it kind of was on the border of, again, being messy versus intentional, and I spent a lot of the time reading this book really trying to decide how much the author was in the driver's seat, how much was this a stream of consciousness or a really intentional book. And overall, I don't see this book as being perfect, and if I'm honest, towards the end, I did get kind of fatigued by the stylistic writing and could have had the story be a little bit more concise, but given the number of pages, I had such a good time reading almost the entirety of this book. I thought it was imaginative, it was out of the box, and I always say that I would so much rather have an author take chances, even if they don't perfectly land something for me. I would much rather them be creative and fresh and do something new and out of the box, rather than playing it safe, which I often find to be quite boring because I'm looking for new experiences in my books, and a lot of times the experience doesn't come necessarily from the particulars of the plot, but really what the author does with the medium. And so if you're like me, who has been leaning more into some more literary works, if you care about narrative composition, the way that the sentences are put together, the framework of the story, if you find those elements interesting, I think you'll really have a good time with this one. If you are solely a plot reader, if you need something that is short and sweet and is going to have a particular plot that will be simple to follow, easy to fly through, this is not a page turner. It's definitely a book to take your time with, and I think that it is so satisfying and feels very earned when you finish it, but I recognize that book is not for everyone. So needless to say, I ended up really enjoying this book, despite the fact that it did a lot of things that normally break my rules of things that I should like. However, as I talk about this book, I'm hoping that I can clarify again those of you that will love this book versus those of you that should stay away, because I often recognize that because I have such niche taste, especially when it comes to science fiction, it means that something that I love, you may not, and we have to figure out together whether or not you should pick up this one. From there, I proceed to read a bunch of really popular modern science fiction books, ones that I feel like I should have gotten to by now, and you're probably surprised I'm only reading for the first time now. The first one is New Moon by Ian McDonald, a very popular book, of course, set on the moon, where we follow various corporations or entities that have control over this space, and so there is political intrigue that's happening. There's a bit of a thriller plot that transpires. It's one that sounded completely up my alley, and I didn't know why I hadn't read it yet. It is doing things that I like. I'm certainly a fan of political intrigue in my fiction, especially with science fiction or fantasy, so that part there was good. But what I found this book to be is just a very surface level thriller. I really expected more of a deep dive into how these corporations got to be so much control of the moon and really going more into the backstory. Instead, it felt a bit more like a plot or setup that was done simply for the sake of progressing a particular story the author wanted to tell. And it was a much more character-focused story than I expected it to be, which would be fine. I like science fiction with a character perspective. However, I found these characters flat. And I often say, and I'll say it probably again in this video, that for me, the challenge with science fiction is that you have these really great ideas, but often they are propped up by characters that I feel to be a bit hollow, and that's very much the case here. So I would have much rather preferred that the author highlighted and focused on, again, the world building aspects and the big ideas, and instead hadn't focused quite so much on the characters, which just felt like a mechanism to get to the end of a particular story and plot. Overall, a little bit disappointed by this one just because I really thought I was gonna love it, and it ended up being a just okay 3-star read for me. Next, we have Revelation Space by Alastair Reynolds. It's the first book in a trilogy. It is set in a future where there is this planet that was previously colonized by an alien race. However, they are gone and now humans have taken their place. And the story is essentially about this individual who's trying to puzzle together what happened all that time ago. And of course, there's some really big ideas explored in this novel, like with the last book. Now with this one, I've read Alastair Reynolds before, so I kind of knew what I was getting myself into. I find he's someone with really great world building and ideas, and I find that characters are not his strength. And so while I love the ideas explored in this one, the characters in my mind, who again were very much the forefront of the story and their relationships and their back and forth, were just not as interesting and really held me back from loving this one. I believe this is perhaps his most popular book and series, perhaps along with House of Suns, but for me, I wish it had been a favorite, but the ideas around the story really fell flat as the author spent a lot of time on characters and dynamics that I didn't think were as interesting as the ideas behind the whole story. Obviously, we need a plot, obviously we need characters in order to make something a fictional work and not just a thought experiment, but it is a challenge that really holds me back from loving this author. While I think I'm someone who just loves great ideas in science fiction, I'm finding more and more that they still need to be backed up by characters that I can be attached to. I don't need to like them, but I need them to be interesting. If they're meant to prop up a particular idea and to be a point of view to experience all this, I need to have a little bit more buy-in. And I just always feel very separated from his characters. I feel like I'm getting a very passive third-person narration. The way he describes the stories just makes me feel like I don't have a stake in it, and it just really holds me back from being entirely engrossed in the story, which ultimately holds me back from really loving it. So a lot I appreciate about this one, but if I'm honest, it should have been a favorite, and I'm so disappointed again that it was not. Maybe I don't like science fiction. I'm starting to worry about this. Also, back in December, the end of my Patreon book club year, we wrapped up by reading A Day of the Triffids by Wyndham. This is an author who I've read before several times, really enjoy, and I was very excited that this was picked as our last book for the year because of the fact that several people have told me to read this book. This is a sci-fi story that definitely has elements of a horror story because it involves these large sentient-like plants that are taking over. And it was really what I expected to be. It had some fun horror, creepy moments to it, a lot of action to it. And at the same time, given the age of the book, there's a strange quaintness or coziness to the writing that felt very comfortable and comforting and all of that. And while this is not my favorite of John Wyndham's books, I do prefer other books more. It's still a solid one. I'm very glad I read it. And again, I'm happy as a reader and reviewer to check another popular book off my list, one that I should have read years ago and I'm finally getting to. This is the year that I finally fill in as many blanks as possible, so hold me to that. And switching over to fantasy, I want to talk about the series that actually inspired A Song of Ice and Fire, and that is of course the Dragonbone share and its sequels in the trilogy, all by Tad Williams. I think a lot of people are at least familiar with this book series because of the fact that after the success of a Game of Thrones, a TV show, and then of course the books, really getting a resurgence in the community, a lot of people wanted to know what to read next, what would be similar, and George R. R. Martin has been very open that this was a book series that he drew a lot of inspiration from. So finally I decided to read it for myself. I did go in with cautious expectations. A few people had mentioned that it's not the exact same, but I wanted to still see if it could scratch some certain itches, or if I could simply just even see some of the inspiration. I thought that would be really interesting. So this is a story that is set in a secondary world where there is upheaval. At the beginning of the story, there is some conversations around succession of the kingdom moving from one ruler to another, and particularly the story is framed around this young boy who, through reasons of plot that I don't want to give away, ends up going out on a quest and going into something that is far larger than himself. And so this one I really enjoyed in terms of the writing, which is probably where I see the biggest comparison. I think that George R. R. Martin is a gorgeous writer in terms of what he does. His prose aren't really purpley or flowery, but they have a distinct style, and I think despite the length of his books, the quality really stays up there, and that is the same way I felt reading this one. I really felt like I could see the way that George R. R. Martin pulled inspiration for his own writing style from here. At least I saw a lot of similarities there. As well, I think the characters are another great point of comparison. While this one is focused more on an individual character rather than a larger cast of characters, although certainly there's lots of secondary ones, you can see that the story once again has really memorable, well fleshed out characters. They are not these flat archetypes, but rather very much the center of the story. You will immediately feel for this young boy, you will care for him, you will worry for him along the way on his journey. And I think George R. R. Martin again is great for fleshing out characters. Now, where these two series separate is the fact that the original work of the Dragonbone share and its sequels are not technically grimdark. If you're someone who loves A Song of Ice and Fire because of the fact that the world is so devastatingly horrible, you will not get the same degree in these books. Now, certainly it doesn't entirely shy away from the darkness of the story, but it's done in a way that is much lighter. So if you're looking for the intensity that you get with A Song of Ice and Fire, you won't find that in the original inspiration, but again, more so the characters and the writing are where I saw the comparisons. And on top of that, it has good world building. It felt a little bit smaller in scale, but that kind of makes sense. You're looking at a trilogy versus a longer series. And so George R. R. Martin ended up having more time to expand on that, which I believe he originally started with a trilogy, but moved on and to make it a longer work. So needless to say, if you're going in and you're not expecting it to be specifically grimdark, I found that it really scratched that itch. It didn't quite hit the same highs for me, but arguably I'm someone who really loves A Song of Ice and Fire largely because of the darkness to it. So this one didn't quite have the same edginess that really pushes it all the way to the top of my favorites, but still very solid. If you are a big fan of fantasy, especially more classically written fantasy, I think you will love this one. Honestly, this is probably more traditional than the series that I normally gush about when it comes to the genre. So I think it's just so well done that, again, if you appreciate fantasy at all, it's really one you need to get to at some point because it's incredibly well executed. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd love to know if there's anything you're planning on skipping based off my review as well. If you're new to my channel, I do read and review a lot of science fiction as well as fantasy. I'd love for you to stick around and subscribe. If you want to help me out with this video, if you think I deserved it, give me a thumbs up, drop a comment, even just a little emoji, and you can hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.